All right, let's jump right into this explainer. If you follow football history, you already know all about the Old Firm, that absolutely massive, legendary clash between Celtic and Rangers in Glasgow. But what we're digging into today isn't just about the passion or the tribalism of the derby. It's actually a fascinating case study of architectural evolution right there on the pitch. We're going to break down exactly how a sudden dramatic injection of Dutch philosophy entirely rewrote the DNA of Scottish football. It basically turned a high-pressure, incredibly physical battleground into this sophisticated laboratory for tactical innovation.
So, how exactly did geometry conquer force? To wrap our heads around this, we have to travel back to the mid-1990s. At that time, the Glasgow Old Firm was basically a closed ecosystem. It was a fiercely proud environment, sure, but tactically, it had become this black box of cyclical failure in Europe. The clubs were completely trapped in their own traditions. They were relying on muscle, heart, and sheer physical force. They desperately needed an outside perspective to break the cycle, and as we'll see, the arrival of a totally new geometric way of thinking changed absolutely everything.
Part 1. The stagnant battlefield, before the Dutch arrival.
Before these Dutch architects showed up, Glasgow was exactly that, a stagnant battlefield. The tactical vocabulary there hadn't really changed for a whole generation. It was defined by rigid 4-4-2 formations, playing the percentages with long balls, and just pure, grueling physical attrition. It was literally about who could run the hardest and tackle the strongest, period. But then, the incoming Dutch style introduced total football. This was a massive collision between that blunt vertical tradition and a highly innovative positional philosophy that demanded a massive upgrade in what we call spatial IQ.
Now, the crucial thing to understand about total football, this brilliant concept born from Rinus Michels and perfected by Johan Cruyff, is that it wasn't just about where you stood. Total football isn't just a formation, it's a theory of space. The core idea is that any player can play any position, provided they actually understand the geometry of the pitch. It's all about how you process the cognitive map of the field around you. You aren't just playing a designated role, you are literally playing the space.
If we chart this revolution, we start down in that grim, attritional era of the early 90s. Then, bam, 1997 hits and Wim Jansen introduces a highly fluid 3-5-2 system at Celtic. Almost immediately, in 1998, Rangers fire back with Dick Advocaat's sophisticated 4-3-3. And if we trace that unbroken line all the way up to the modern tactical landscape of 2026, the sheer speed of this structural earthquake was absolutely breathtaking.
Part 2. The Blueprint of Fluidity with Wim Jansen at Celtic.
When Jansen arrived, he didn't just tweak a few training sessions. He fundamentally altered how the players processed the game itself. He was the subtle architect of this whole revolution, and his job was to turn a rigid squad into a fluid, thinking machine. He systematically dismantled that traditional British reliance on fixed, designated roles, replacing them with positional interchangeability. He basically transformed Celtic's blunt approach into a highly sophisticated 3-5-2 system. This was a massive cognitive shift. It created this diamond-based possession machine. Suddenly, you had defenders stepping up into midfield, midfielders dropping back into defense, and the opposition was completely lost. They simply didn't know who to mark.
Moving on to Part 3. The Industrial Standard, courtesy of Dick Advocaat at Rangers.
Meanwhile, right across the city in 1998, Rangers countered with their very own Dutch mastermind, the little general, Dick Advocaat. Now, if Jansen was the subtle architect, Advocaat was the industrialist of the Dutch school. He brought this formidable, almost intimidating level of professional intensity to the club. He introduced a continental 4-3-3 system, complete with overlapping fullbacks, narrow-set midfielders, and a massive emphasis on rapid transition speed. But to pull that off, he needed a totally different kind of player. He actively went out and recruited highly technical athletes, guys like Arthur Newman and Giovanni van Bronckhorst. Their profiles were vastly different from your typical Scottish recruit back then. Advocaat dictated the game's rhythm through these sophisticated tactics, and it forced the rest of the league to wake up to a harsh new reality. If you couldn't pass the ball as well as Rangers, you were absolutely going to lose.
Part 4. The Structural Reset, or How They Finally Fixed the Black Box.
To really get why both of these managers were so extraordinarily successful, we need to look under the hood at how they fixed the old firm's black box of cyclical failure. You see, they didn't just ship in better players, they installed a completely new operating system. They provided a massive structural reset across 3 foundational pillars. First, breaking the long ball addiction. Second, implementing intense cognitive conditioning. And third, driving Europeanization. This reset was the absolute key to elevating Celtic and Rangers from being just powerful local institutions into highly credible, dangerous European powerhouses once again.
This reset was incredibly deliberate.
Take that first pillar, breaking the long ball addiction. That meant prioritizing ball retention above absolutely everything else. It was about maintaining your shape while patiently probing for cracks, instead of just desperately launching the ball forward and hoping for the best. Then, cognitive conditioning. This demanded a much higher spatial IQ. It meant running smarter, not just harder, and constantly scanning the pitch. And the end result of mirroring all these continental trends? True Europeanization. They were finally able to shed their insular reputations and really compete at the highest levels across the continent.
Part 5. The enduring Dutch legacy in 2026 and beyond.
When you watch a match today, the impact of this era isn't just some dusty history lesson. The foundation they laid down back then is still the absolute bedrock of how both clubs operate at the elite level. You can see their modern tactical descendants everywhere. The inverted fullbacks we see deployed at Ibrox, or those highly fluid midfield rotations happening at Celtic, these are the direct genetic descendants of that Tulip Revolution. These modern tactics are proof that a football club isn't just a fixed asset. It's a living, breathing system that has to constantly evolve its geometric architecture if it wants to stay ahead of the opposition.
I absolutely love this quote from the source material, because it perfectly summarizes the entire era. The geometry of intelligence will always eventually triumph over the physics of force. It beautifully captures how this wave of tactical innovation took a highly pressurized, incredibly physical rivalry and turned it into a fascinating laboratory. It shows us unequivocally that brain power, spatial awareness, and a cohesive philosophy can completely neutralize sheer physical dominance.
We're going to leave you with this immutable lesson to think about. Innovation is rarely welcome, but it is always necessary. Just think about how this applies to your own industries, or even your own passions. Look, when these Dutch systems first arrived in Glasgow, traditionalists absolutely hated them. They called them soft, they called them impractical. But you know what? Once the trophies started piling up, all of that skepticism completely evaporated. So I'll leave you with this question. Where in your own world are you still relying on the physics of force when you really should be exploring the geometry of intelligence?